Welcome students, Assalamu alaikum. We have already started this chapter and I have already given you a background and the main reasons for the war. I'm going to repeat myself only briefly. So again, one of the main reason was that the Italy and Germany had unified in 18th century. Before that, Italy consisted of various free city-states, and Germany also consisted of some city-states and some smaller empires like the Bavarian Empire, the Bohemian Empire, the Prussian Empire, and other. So they actually unified at the later end of the 18th century. So after that, they realized that they have missed the colonization train. They have missed the imperialism train. At the time, most of the colonies were already owned by either France or Britain, so they wanted some colonies of their own. In fact, the Italians actually they tried to invade the Libya, that at that time was part of Ottoman Empire, and they also tried to invade Ethiopia as well, to gain some colonies of their own. Germans also wanted some colonies of their own, and the Brits and the French they actually saw it as a uh, challenge to their hegemony, or challenge to their own imperialist ambitions. But what really caused were the very complex alliances in Europe. So at that time, the Ottoman Empire had just been defeated in the Balkan War. Balkan War was actually a part of the Ottoman Empire, the European part of the Ottoman Empire. And after many wars with Austria-Hungary and Russia, they had actually been defeated in this particular area, and most of these countries actually became independent. So both the Austria-Hungary and Russians they wanted to have their influence in the Balkans, and they were both vying for control over the Balkans. And the Russians at that time had the largest army of any country, and the Austro-Hungarians they were actually worried that if the Russians decided to march on the Balkans, that they would not be able to stop them. So what they did, they actually created an alliance with the German Empire. German Empire at that time had the most disciplined army. They did not have the largest army, but their army was the most disciplined in Europe at that particular time. So what they were hoping that if the Russians will become aggressors, then the Germans or the German army will help them to counter the Russians. So after seeing that the what the Russians did, they actually allied themselves with the French and the British, and they created Triple Entente. So what it meant was that if the Germans were to help Austro-Hungarians against the Russians, then the Brits and the French will attack the Germans on the other side. So as you can see, it quickly became very confusing and very complex, and this was also the main reason behind the war as well. So the event that actually triggered the war was the assassination of the heir of Austro-Hungary. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was actually visiting Serbia at the time, and in Sarajevo, he was actually assassinated by a Bosnian, and this actually led to war between Austria and Serbia. Austria initially demanded some demands to be met. Serbia actually complied, but still the war happened, and the Hungary again. Austria and Hungary at that time were a unified empire. They had different political nobility, like the political leadership were different, but they were a single empire. So the king of the emperor of Austria was also the emperor of Hungary. Again, very confusing, but that was the norm in the Europe at that particular time. The alliances were very complex. So Austria-Hungary actually actually went to war with the Serbia, and since the Germans were allied with the Austria-Hungary, they were also involved in this war. They actually wanted to keep the war between Austrians and Serbs, but the Serbians were ethnically more closely related to the Russians. Serbians are also Slavic, and the Russians are also Slavic people. So, and even after the demise of Ottoman Empire in that particular area, Serbs and Russians were very close to each other, both politically and socially as well. So, in this war between Austria and Serbia, Russia started to back Serbia, but the Hungarians and Germans actually started to back Austria. Now the Germans knew that they will eventually be drawn with the war in a war with Russia. So what they wanted to actually keep the war between Austria and Serbia. But seeing that the Russians were going to be involved, they actually demanded British and French to remain neutral while they are fighting the Russians. And again, they did not comply. They did not do it. So what happened was the Germans at that time they opened both fronts. They actually demanded safe passage of their troops from Luxembourg and Belgium. Both countries refused, and Germans attacked both these countries. And since Belgium was also allied with Britain, in fact, Britain and Belgium have a long-standing treaty between each other that still holds today, that Britain will ensure the independence and freedom of Belgium. So whoever attacks Belgium, they quickly go into war with British. That is again exactly the same thing that happened at that time. There, this created two vastly opposing countries, that were two vastly opposing armies. The one was the Germans, Austrians, and in fact, at the later stage, Ottomans also joined. And at other side of the war were the French, the British, and the Russians. So the battles of the First World War, the most important of these battles is the Battle of Somme. It is one of the largest battles even to this day as well. It actually started in 1916 in northern France. The British commander at the time was the General Haig. So the why is this battle so important? Because its death toll was absolutely mind-boggling. On a single day, more than like a million soldiers from both sides will die. In fact, in the first day of the battle, more than 60,000 British soldiers were badly wounded and killed during this battle. And almost the same number was killed on the German side as well. At that time, you would usually dig trenches and then fight off the opposing army. So that is why it is also known as the Battle of Trenches as well. There were a number of inventions that actually happened during this particular war, like the aircraft. While the aircraft was not invented during the First World War, it was actually invented way before than the First World War. But its use in the warfare actually started during the First World War. The next was synthetic rubber. So during the war, the natural rubber was not very available, and both the chemists from both countries, like the Russians and Germans, they both started to develop synthetic rubber that was widely produced to make tires. The other thing was the synthetic chemicals like ammonia. This was a very important, very important invention of this particular time. Not only does it was it used to create explosive, it is also used as a fertilizer as well. In fact, this is the invention that actually made possible the green revolution after the Second World War, that actually saw population boom throughout the world. And the last and the most destructive of this invention was also the tank. The main battle tanks that are used in the war, they have a much different look right now than they used to have during that particular war. But that was also invented during the First World War. Now the impacts of World War One on Europe are very deep. It actually ended in 1918, and it caused two of the empires on the opposing ends, like the Austro-Hungarian and Russian Empire, to collapse. Both of these actually completely collapsed. Another very important thing was that the war before First World War was seen as a glorious event. But after the World War One, while the war would be considered necessary, it will never be glorified. Why? Because not only a lot of troops died, but in fact a lot of the situation in the trenches, situation during the battles was also very grim. and the people that actually suffered these, they actually returned to home, and they started to write about this. And in fact, one of the veterans was Ernst Hemingway, and Hemingway later would be a very influential writer in the English literature. So there were also some political and socio-political changes like the Russian Revolution. I have just told you that the Russian Empire collapsed after the war. Why? Because not only was it defeated by the Germans, but it also caused the rise of Bolsheviks in that particular country. It was led by Vladimir Lenin against the Tsar, or the king of the Russians, who was forced to abdicate and was eventually killed, and his regime was replaced by a socialist government. The next important thing that happened was the women's empowerment, especially in Britain. So while most of the men were drafted to fight in the war, the economies or the factories back home were actually very short of men to staff their factories or to work in the factories or in the fields. So most of these jobs were given to the women, and it actually started a very empowering era in women's history, and it also led to the suffragette movement, which gave the women the right of voting and the right to be admitted in universities as well. Again, the Austria-Hungary and German Empire, all of them actually collapsed, and they all turned into republics. Austria-Hungary also became a republic. Well, Austria and Hungary were actually became two separate republics, and German Empire also collapsed and was replaced by a German republic. The war actually ended with the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a very one-sided document. So what happened is, in 1917, the United States of America also jumped into the war, led by their president Woodrow Wilson. He actually, when the Americans joined the war, the balance was tipped against the Germans and in the favor of British forces, and they imposed this treaty on the Germans. They actually wanted to make Germany very docile, and they actually wanted to keep Germany so weak that it will not be able to, rise up again. But that actually did not happen. This document actually recognized Germany as the main perpetrator or main belligerent of the war. Not the Austro-Hungarians, not the Russians, and not the Serbs, but the Germans. And they actually imposed massive reparations on them. What were reparations? Reparations were actually the money that the Germans had to give to uh, allies like the British and the Americans and French and the Belgians. So it was too much for the German economy to bear, and they almost collapsed. Even the German army was restricted to 100,000 soldiers, and they were not allowed to have an air force, and they were also not allowed to have any reserve army as well. This was one of the main reasons that most Germans actually became very bitter towards the Allies, and this was also what later caused the rise of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler. And I have already discussed in class what atrocious personality Adolf Hitler was and what atrocities the Nazi Party has committed. And again, we will, if I have not, then we will discuss it as well. Okay, one other impact that the First World War had was the formation of League of Nations. League of Nations can be considered as a prereq of United Nations. It was again an international organization that included most of the free countries at that time. But the problem was most of the countries were actually, colonized, like the British India, which were actually not free in their foreign affairs. So this was not actually very popular. In fact, while the League of Nations was actually presented by US President Woodrow Wilson, United States actually never formally joined the League of Nations. So that was also, take it however you want. The main purpose of the League of Nations was to avoid any future wars. Of course, it failed because the World War II also broke out. which still continues to remain the most destructive war in the human history. It was not very effective. League of Nations was also not very effective because again I have told you that United States was not never joined it. In fact, the Germans also never joined it, and the Soviet Union or the Russians at that time, they also never joined this league. So like the most powerful of countries, they were actually not part of this league. They were free to do whatever they wanted, and that actually led to the destruction of it. And again, the league actually ceased to exist in 1946 and was replaced by United Nations. Okay, students. So at this point, your chapter has been completed. You don't have to, uh, complete this chapter in one sitting. You can actually take your time, take 2 or 3 or how many days you want. You can take your time to complete this. You can actually refer to the book. You are encouraged to refer to the book and to this tutorial as well. And again, I will see you in next tutorial. We will discuss the exercise of this chapter and previous chapter in our next tutorial. Okay, students, Allah Hafiz.